It sounds like the ultimate campfire ghost story. A mysterious stranger arrives in a town wearing multicolored clothes and carrying a silver flute. He saves the community from a plague of rats, but when the town council refuses to pay him, he enacts a cruel revenge. He plays his pipe again, lures every child away from their homes, and marches them into the hills, never to be seen again. Most of us know this as a fairy tale, but for the people of Hamelin, Germany, this isn't just a story. They insist it actually happened, and if you look closely at the historical records, they might be right. The real question is, what exactly was the Pied Piper? Was he a magician, a metaphor, or a very real, very dangerous human being? The traditional version of the tale is etched into our collective consciousness. Sometime in the Middle Ages, Hamelin suffers from a massive rat infestation. A Pied Piper, meaning someone dressed in patchwork colors, offers to solve the problem for a fee. He plays his tune, leads the vermin into the Wisha River, and they drown. When the town reneges on the payment, he returns on June 26, the feast day of Saints John and Paul. This time, he plays a different melody. The children follow him out of the city gates and vanish. Regardless of how the story ends in various books, the figure of the Piper has become a permanent cultural shorthand. We use the term to describe anyone with dangerous charisma, from corrupt politicians to cult leaders. We also use the phrase "pay the piper" to remind people that every debt eventually comes due. Over the centuries, the story has been retold countless times. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe wrote about it in the early 1800s, framing the Piper as a supernatural elemental force. The brothers Grimm polished it into a cautionary fable about the consequences of ingratitude. By the Victorian era, Robert Browning's famous poem turned it into a nursery rhyme, which softened the edges for younger audiences. From there, the character drifted into pure fantasy. He appeared in operas, ballets, and cartoons, shifting from a tragic villain to a misunderstood anti-hero, depending on the decade. But while the rest of the world treated it as fiction, the town of Hamelin refused to let the reality fade. For centuries, the town's civic records didn't speak of a fairy tale, they spoke of a specific, dated tragedy. This is where the story shifts from folklore to a genuine historical mystery. If you had visited the market church in Hamelin around the year 1300, you would have seen a stained glass window depicting a colorful figure leading a procession of white-clad children. Although the original window was destroyed in the 17th century, descriptions and sketches of it survived. It suggests that the legend was commemorating a literal event that happened just outside the church doors. The town's own chronicles are even more chilling. A frantic entry in the town records from 1384 doesn't mention rats or magic. It simply marks time with a devastating sentence. It is 100 years since our children left. This wasn't written as literature, it was a civic reminder of a catastrophe. You can still find physical traces of this trauma in the city today. There is a rat catcher's house with an inscription dating the event to June 26, 1284. There is also a street in town where by law no music or dancing is allowed. It is known as the Bungelosenstrasse, or Street Without Drums, because it is believed to be the path the children took as they walked out of the city forever. We also have a written account from the mid-15th century known as the Lüneburg Manuscript. It describes a well-dressed man appearing in town and leading 130 children out of the East Gate to a place called Calvary, where they simply disappeared. Crucially, none of these early historical sources mention rats. The rat catcher element doesn't appear in the story until the mid-16th century, nearly 300 years after the event. It seems the rats were added later to spice up the narrative. The original records focus entirely on the sudden, unexplained loss of the town's youth. So, if the rats were a fabrication, who or what took the children? Historians have spent decades trying to decode the metaphor, and several dark theories have emerged. One common interpretation is that the Pied Piper was a symbol for disease. Medieval Europeans often personified death as a skeletal figure playing a flute or a fiddle, leading victims in a danse macabre, or dance of death. In this version, the Piper isn't a man, but an allegory for a plague or epidemic that wiped out a generation of Hamelin's youth. If a disease swept through the town, the image of a musician leading the children away might have been a way for the grieving community to process the loss artistically. Others have looked at the geology of the region. Some suggest that a sinkhole or landslide near the river could have swallowed a group of children, and the story of the earth opening up was a literal description of a natural disaster. Then there is the theory of choreomania, or dancing mania. Between the 13th and 16th centuries, Europe saw strange outbreaks where hundreds of people would dance uncontrollably until they collapsed from exhaustion. In 1237, a group of children reportedly danced from the city of Erfurt to a neighboring town, and similar events happened in Strasbourg. These dancers often wore bright, colorful clothes and claimed to be in a trance. It is possible the children of Hamelin were swept up in a similar mass hysteria following a leader out of town in a delirious state. Another historical possibility links the story to the Crusades. In the early 13th century, itinerant preachers wandered historically through Germany, recruiting people for the ill-fated Children's Crusade. These recruiters were often charismatic zealots who promised glory in the Holy Land. If such a figure passed through Hamelin and convinced the town's youth to follow him, the parents would have effectively lost their children to slavery, death, or starvation on the road. In this context, the piping wasn't music, but the seductive rhetoric of a fanatic. A darker, more criminal theory suggests the piper was a trafficker. Medieval merchants and recruiters were known to entice workers with false promises, and selling children into servitude was not unknown in desperate times. The town might have later invented the supernatural elements to cover up the shame of having failed to protect their young from a human predator. Some historians, like William Manchester, have even suggested the legend masks the work of a serial killer. In a time with no organized police force, a predator who abducted and murdered children might be mythologized as a dark, magical figure because the reality was too horrific to confront directly. These theories are all plausible. They explain the grief and the loss. However, most modern historians believe the answer lies in something far more bureaucratic, yet equally permanent. To understand what likely happened, we have to look at the language. In medieval records, the phrase "children of the town" didn't necessarily mean little kids. It was often a legal term for citizens, particularly the younger generation. In 13th century Germany, the economy was changing. The eldest sons inherited the family land and business, leaving younger siblings with very few prospects. At the same time, German nobility was pushing eastward, looking to colonize lands in what is now Poland and Romania. They needed bodies to clear forests, build towns, and farm crops. To find these settlers, nobles hired professional recruiters known as locators. These men were essentially headhunters. They were well-dressed, charismatic, and often carried large sums of money. They would travel from town to town, beating a drum or playing a flute to attract a crowd, and then make their pitch: leave your overcrowded, poverty-stricken home and come east to a new land, where you will be given your own farm and freedom from taxes. If you were a young adult in Hamelin with no inheritance and no future, this offer would have sounded like salvation. The details fit the legend perfectly. A colorful stranger arrives. He is a persuasive talker. He targets the children of the town, the young workforce. He leads them out of the East Gate, which is exactly the direction of the colonization efforts, and crucially, they never return. We even have linguistic evidence to support this. Linguists have traced surnames that were common in Hamelin during the 1200s and found them appearing suddenly in the records of eastern regions like Brandenburg and Pomerania around the same time. There are even villages in Poland with names that sound suspiciously like variations of Hamelin or its nearby landmarks. It suggests a mass migration of a specific group of people who took their names and memories with them. So was the real Pied Piper terrifying? If you were a parent in Hamelin in 1284, absolutely. You watched a stranger walk into your town, charm your sons and daughters with promises of a better life, and then lead them away forever. Whether they left for land, money, or adventure, the result for the community was the same: a sudden, total loss of an entire generation. Over time, the heartbreak turned into a legend. The recruiter became a wizard, his sales pitch became a magic spell, and the rats were added to explain why a stranger would have been there in the first place. But the core of the story remains a true historical event. The Pied Piper wasn't a monster who lived in a cave, he was a salesman who made an offer the young people of Hamelin couldn't refuse, and that reality is perhaps more haunting than any ghost story.